Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Intersection. This is the place where we center conversations on social and economic topics, including personal growth, living intentionally, and women, peace, and security. I am your host, Shrina Alexander Benjamin. Like, comment, and share this podcast. Today, we look at advocacy and incorporating an intersectionality lens in advocacy planning. Now, remember, one of our mottos here is live intentionally because you can, and always keep a goal in mind. So let us get started. Yes, we do. Now, Rennie Edu Lodge once said, I do not want to be included. Instead, I want to question who created the standard in the first place. After a lifetime of embodying difference, I have no desire to be equal. I want to deconstruct the structural power of a system that marked me out as different. I don't want to be assimilated into the status quo. I want to be liberated from all the negative assumptions that my characteristics bring. Now, this is a powerful quote, which I love. In 2005, I publicly broke my silence about the severe and inhumane abuse I experienced as a child. While my voice and knees trembled when I spoke, I put on a brave face and talked about the self-destructive path, the abuse and violence which set me on that particular path. I spoke about the various barriers I experienced as an African Caribbean Black girl who had no name on her birth certificate and was labeled a bastard under colonial law because I was born out of wedlock. Yes. I talked about not realizing I was an orphan until years later. I spoke of the barriers I experienced that placed the starting line for my life meters behind many other children my age. And I talked about my vision for change. Sounds exciting, right? A few weeks later, I launched a Facebook page titled, I am saying no to abuse because, I wanted to use my voice and I wanted to advocate. In my mind, I believed launching a Facebook page was advocacy. Yeah. I did not know that establishing a Facebook page that garnered thousands of likes in the weeks ahead was only one element of advocacy. While I launched the page and began to speak out, older women advocates did not take my hand and teach me because I realized that many of them did not know how to define advocacy, nor what advocacy was when they championed various causes. Instead, what transpired is something that is still transpiring today, and many advocates endure this, is instead I was criticized. My actions were criticized to the point where a leading women's rights activist asked me back then, what is your claim to fame? I looked her in her eyes and said, the scars that I bear. I went further and told her, they are not my claim to fame, but if I can use the debris of my life to effect change, that is what I will do. Today, surprisingly, this same woman advocate, she launches praises on me for the work I have been steadfastly doing over the years. And I have had excellent opportunities to fail, yes, to fail, to intentionally grow, to learn and to share knowledge by facilitating space to empower others to utilize the advocacy process for change. So today, I am going to define advocacy, not teach an advocacy course. What I will do is share knowledge on advocacy and steps to increase the same, intersectionality, and why incorporating an intersectionality lens in our advocacy planning is critical. So a lot of the things that I will be presenting will not be these deep advocacy tools that one will gain doing an advocacy course, which I facilitate. It would gives but what I'm doing is providing this space to give some basic knowledge on how you can enhance your advocacy effectiveness and the importance of incorporating those or this intersectionality lens in your work. So advocacy must be contextualized. The onus is on each person, group, or organization to develop a working definition of advocacy based on their context as they attempt to turn their case into a cause. And because advocacy is so broad and it is defined differently by different people based on the work that they're doing and the context of the work, it must be contextualized. For, this process here, I will use the following working definition of advocacy, which is advocacy is a strategically planned, action-oriented, intentional process directed at changing unhealthy social and cultural norms and behaviors, oppressive systems and structures in the collaborative pursuit of equity, power sharing, social, gender, and economic justice, right? So that's just my own working definition of advocacy. For this space, right? Advocacy is both a process and an outcome where different methods are incorporated or used to maintain and sustain the advocacy process to realize specific objectives. The approach should be human-centered, transformative, and solution-driven. Because power is embedded in the institutional frameworks of institutions and organizations in our society, how power is used by an institution, group, or individual will guide the advocacy approaches used. Now, Covey and Miller in 2007, based on their research and power model, developed or established 3 common advocacy and empowerment approaches that take into consideration the questions they raise about power. And these are advocacy for the people, which looks at public interest and approaches. And under that, there's a lot of, areas that can be looked at. And this is used based on the type of power that the person or group has. And I'm just giving a basic, overarching view of those approaches, advocacy and empowerment approaches that Covey and Miller spoke about. Again, in courses I facilitate, we go much deeper into these The second one is advocacy with the people, citizen action approaches. And the third one is advocacy by the people, transformational approaches. Now, how do we increase the effectiveness of our advocacy? And I always start off by saying, if problems remain invisible, they also remain unknown and they are unsolvable. For what is not seen is not addressed. To increase your advocacy effectiveness, you must first make the problem visible. To do this, you must identify it and acknowledge that it exists. As what is not seen cannot be addressed, and what is not addressed remains the same. And then we normalize what is not addressed as part of a natural experience. The second thing I would encourage or recommend is that you analyze the problem using a chosen problem analytical tool. Problems and issues are different, and many times people get those mixed up. Problems are broad areas of concern. Issues are aspects of the problem around which you can advocate for change. For example, domestic violence is a social problem. It is a broad area of concern. After analyzing the problem, various issues may emerge, and you may want to select one issue to plan your advocacy around, or many issues. Analyzing the problem enables you to prioritize issues and channel your resources. The third recommendation that I would suggest is identifying the issue you aim to turn into your cause. There are way too many people jumping on causes they are not aligned with. As such, commitment for the long haul will be lacking. When you identify the issue, then you ask yourself questions. One of those questions would be, is this something that I can commit to? Is this something that I am passionate about? Is this issue causing harm to groups and groups of people that I may not know about? And am I willing to network, to collaborate, and to once again commit? The fourth recommendation I often look at is identifying interest groups. Who are the groups working on this particular issue that you have identified? Where are they located? How long have they been in existence? How much work have they done? Identifying interest groups reduces reinventing the wheel and creates strength in numbers. So you may look at the problem, you may identify an issue, and you may be all charged up to go and say, okay, I'm going to plan and I'm going to get into that phase of advocacy and developing my method of advocacy. But then you have not looked at who is already doing the work. So then you would be reinventing the wheel. Now, if you look at who is doing the work and then you notice a gap, then your advocacy can fill that gap. Number 5, name the issue and the strategy you would like to use. So after you identify the issue, you name it, all right? So for example, domestic violence, broad problem. The issue may be, 1, educating law enforcement officers, because the lack of education of law enforcement officers reduces their responsiveness to adequately serve victims when they come into the stations to make a report. So you name the issue. Now you develop the strategy. How are you going to advocate for this particular issue, which is the training of law enforcement officers? What methods would you employ? Who will you bring into this process of advocacy? What is the duration of the advocacy process? Number 6, assess forces who may be against your advocacy efforts. Now, many persons may hear this and they were like, oh, these people who would want to go against what we are doing. Bear in mind that many times people go against something because they do not have the accurate information. Now, this is a golden opportunity when you assess forces who may be against your advocacy efforts. You're able to meet with these actors and come together, not on a belief system, but on a value-based system, so that domestic violence, which is a problem, affects everyone directly and indirectly. The issue of lack of training for law enforcement officers is perpetuating domestic violence and perpetuating silence of victims. This affects everyone because there are economic impacts, psychological impacts, health and wellness impacts, and there is a cost to all of this. So when you are able to engage and build rapport with the forces or the actors that may be against your efforts, you may be able to gain buy-in because now they have a clearer picture. They are informed, so they can make an informed decision based on the information that has been provided to them. So now you have gained an ally. The 7th recommendation I often give is develop your plan of action, which will be adaptable and include outcomes and impacts and milestones. So developing the plan of action is not something you do by yourself. You work with your group or your team with external and internal stakeholders to develop what this advocacy process would look like. Who are the persons that you need to target? So if we're looking at law enforcement officers and training, we need to target the senior officials within the law enforcement agency. We may need to target the person who is responsible for the portfolio of national security. You may need to target public officials who craft legislation and public policy. You may need to target senior officers who work on the curriculum for law enforcement officers and their intake and training, and also the community. So you work with your team to plan what your advocacy process would look like. You look at your risk, you look at your opportunities, you look at your resources, you look at the time frame, you look at what is relevant, and what is realistic, what is timely, what is smart. And you develop your plan not in a way that it is closed, but you develop an adaptable plan where you can be agile. And you include your outcomes what would you like to see happen as a result of law enforcement officers being trained? The impact. How would training law enforcement officers impact the constituents, impact the law enforcement service itself, and impact the broader society? And milestones. Yes, I am doing my T's. What milestones will you put in place as a marker to show that you are achieving your objectives? Number 8 is document the process to historicize your work and presence. For many of us, and I have been guilty of this in the past, that I have been actively engaged in so many advocacy processes, but I never documented it. And when we don't document things, our contribution to those processes gets lost, because sometimes we're dealing with the human mind, and the human mind is also quick to sometimes intentionally forget. And then there's just often this slip of memory where we forget, right? So it is imperative that you document the process to historicize your work and presence. Number 9, celebrate small successes. At one point in time, I was so focused on achieving and advocating that I was literally stiffed. And when I say stiffed, I mean I wasn't looking left, I wasn't looking right. And every time I reached a milestone, I said to myself, it wasn't good enough. I have to go again. I have to go again. I did not take the time to just be grateful that I was able to just get a meeting with that public official, or I was invited to speak, or at an event, or a recommendation that I made was considered. So those small successes, I was just focused on that long term, so that I did not give myself grace to celebrate those small successes, which would enable me to just pause for a moment and look at the work and be like, wow. So learn to celebrate those small successes. 10, provide resources and create space for people to connect with your work online and offline, and develop strategies to maintain and sustain the same. Again, I was guilty of this in the past, that I would start advocacy processes and I would not have the resources to leave with persons to connect with me and to maintain those connections. And I did not develop a strategy at that point in time to continue maintaining and sustaining that online presence and that online momentum of the work, even when I may have been, away in physical spaces. Number 11, know when to revisit your plans, close the chapter, or include other issues. So in the process of advocacy planning, one of the elements is developing a timeline and knowing when to monitor that timeline at the realization of the goal, and knowing when to close the chapter. Many times when the chapter should be closed, we continue to keep the chapter open, and then we continue just going around in a circle. All right, in a circle. So knowing when to close the chapter, or revisiting of the plans, allow us to look and say, okay, we have this particular issue of training of law enforcement officers, and we need now to incorporate effective investigation processes so that they intersect to create a healthy reporting process and mechanism, but also a healthy space for victims to report. And, you know, I love to put this in. Always remember that you cannot change outcomes without understanding how they came about. All right. So that is the advocacy part, which is just a brief outline of advocacy and how to enhance or increase your advocacy effectiveness. And I will now go into intersectionality. And this is just an overview, all right, for a deeper conversation or idea about intersectionality. There are workshops that I facilitate, and also some of my team members. So the key thing to remember is that the problems and issues that individuals and groups experience are not isolated, nor are they independent of each other. They actually intersect. And effective advocacy should take into consideration the intersections of people's lived realities. For years, social problems have been addressed in isolation. For example, many international organizations and community-based organizations provide feminine napkins for young girls residing in different African countries, with the belief that distributing feminine napkins will prevent young girls from dropping out of school. However, they often overlook the multiple internal and external issues that intersect and then converge, acting as barriers to young girls' advancement. I must state here that I am all for providing feminine napkins to young girls and women. Actually, 2 days ago, I volunteered with the Feminine Hygiene Sewing Project here in Indiana at Peggy's Sewing Barn. However, the intersectionality lens would unpack the layers of young women and girls' experiences to give a holistic view of the factors that work against them, and for us to develop solutions on ways to counter those factors. An intersectionality analysis or approach allows us to see who is included, who is excluded, the types of power dynamics and relationships at play, and how those affect experiences and identities, with the knowledge, you know, and I want to hone in here on this aspect of knowledge that identifies that identities are not single, isolated experiences. Identities include things like the beliefs we hold, our experiences, our environments in which we're socialized, and the challenges that we face. Okay, so when we speak about identities, we're not speaking about one isolated thing. All right. Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the multiple ways that varying forms of inequality, discrimination, oppression, and disadvantage sometimes compound themselves and create obstacles that are often not understood within conventional ways of thinking. I adapted this definition from Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor and social theorist who first coined the term intersectionality in her 1989 paper, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. However, she gave credit to the Black advocates that went before her and spoke about intersectionality, especially in terms of the Black experience as the theory about intersectionality emerged 2 decades earlier when Black feminists began to speak out about the white middle class nature of the mainstream feminist movement. And when I began studying about intersectionality some years ago, I was like, okay, I recall speaking about the concept of intersectionality, but not knowing what it was, because women of African descent and Black and brown bodies experience things differently than our fellow female counterparts. So this is the same for Indigenous women and women from the global South, especially marginalized or disadvantaged populations. So at some point in time in our experience, in our advocacy, in our work, we have included to some extent the concept or use the concept of intersectionality, but we were not aware that, hey, this is what this is. And Crenshaw basically popularized intersectionality. And what I loved about her when she popularized it, she did not claim it as her own, but she gave credit to the wonderful advocates who were using it before she came on the scene. So somebody may be asking, what are conventional ways of thinking? So conventional ways of thinking look at isolated issues. For example, a woman is violently abused by her partner. Conventional ways of thinking will only look at removing the woman from the abusive environment and overlook all the other issues that frame, contribute, and enable the manifestation of violence in this woman's life and act as barriers hindering her from receiving adequate and responsive support and living a fulfilled and abundant life. So we must understand the intersections of our lived realities to advocate for change across all spheres effectively and identify how power and privilege intersect, working for or against groups of people or promoting justice and equity. As I touch on privilege, I would like to say that all of us have some measure or type of privilege, and we should not be judged nor feel guilty for the specific privilege or privileges that we have, whether we are aware of them or not. However, we must make a conscious decision to be informed about what type of privileges that we have, utilize those privileges in a way that restores human dignity, speak out against atrocities, and support disadvantaged populations, including embracing opportunities to inform and educate groups of people who have different types of privileges and power and are not using it or are using it to oppress, discriminate, and marginalize groups of people. So I would like you to take a minute and close your eyes, yes, and imagine Simone. Eyes closed, just imagine Simone. And I will tell you a bit more about Simone. So just close your eyes and just imagine. And with everything that I add to Simone, you just add it to your imagination and think about Simone. So Simone is a Black woman in her 20s. And when I say in her 20s, she's 25 years old. And she should be proud and full of joy. However, sadly, some people do not like Simone because of the color of her skin. Black, brown bodies. Simone faces oppression, violence, and discrimination for being in a Black and brown body. She faces oppression, violence, and discrimination for being a woman, for not having a formal education, living in a rural community, having an invisible disability, faces oppression, violence, and discrimination for her religious practices, her language, and her socio-economic class. Now, these are 7 layers that compound themselves and create obstacles to Simone seeking and receiving adequate support and getting to a place of self-actualization and upward mobility. Now, imagine that we add a few more layers to Simone's experience. We add another layer. She's a victim of sexual assault and rape. We add another layer. She is an adult victim of childhood abuse. We add another layer. She has 4 children, 2 as a result of rape. So those 7 layers I previously stated. Now we have added 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, 10 layers to Simone's experience. All right. Many organizations would only consider one issue, and most often it may be a predominant one. For example, Simone's lack of education, or the presence or the fact that Simone is a victim of sexual assault and rape, and they will concentrate on those 2 issues. And there's nothing wrong in concentrating on those 2 issues. What intersectionality lens does is allow us as advocates, as practitioners, as helping professionals to look beyond these 2 predominant issues that we may find emerging and look at tapping into other resources that we can connect Simone to, so that she can have an experience, a holistic experience of healing, to live a fulfilled and productive life. Now, many other layers, when you look through those conventional lens of just the lack of education or the fact that Simone is a victim of sexual assault and rape, Many other layers are not being addressed to support Simone to live, as I said, a fulfilled and abundant life. And one where she is sustainable, self-reliant, and becomes a productive, value-based asset to herself, children, and society. So what the importance of including, what is the importance of including an intersectionality lens to advocacy? One, incorporating an intersectionality framework makes the invisible visible and the unconscious conscious. There's this popular quote that says, until we make the unconscious conscious, we will continue doing the same thing or engaging in the same ways of thinking, and we would call it fate. All right, I may have quoted that wrong, but it's along those lines. Number two, incorporating an intersectionality lens in our advocacy planning helps us to understand the multiple ways that privilege and oppression enable varying forms of inequity, discrimination, and oppression, and how these compound themselves, creating layers of disadvantages, not disadvantage, disadvantages for an individual and or group, and obstacles that are often not understood within conventional ways of thinking. So, number three, it helps us identify the types of systemic, structural, institutional, symbolic, and political violence which act as barriers to equity and enable unequal power relations. Number four, it enhances our advocacy and lobbying, enabling us to develop strategic approaches to drive social change and transformation at the individual, family, community, and broader societal levels. It helps us incorporate the domains of change approach to developing solution-oriented plans. Number six, it helps us rethink partnerships and identify key stakeholders to collaborate with and identify forces working against us. Number seven, we can center our work on social justice, taking into account individuals or groups of people, overlapping identities and lived experiences to understand the complexity of discrimination, inequity, and disadvantages to better understand how these act as barriers to their advancement, success, access, and control. Understanding is key. So in closing, I leave you with these points, action points. Intersectionality is not the only theory, framework, model that can be incorporated into your advocacy or work. It's an addition to enhance or amplify your work. Understand there is a danger in adopting an ideology or model rather than adapting it. Critically reflect on your work and the issues you address to identify the layers of oppression people face. Identify ways or areas of your work where you can include an intersectionality approach. Remember, you cannot do everything. Connecting with competent allies, even persons you assume are an enemy, to provide areas of service you cannot. And I say here assume because many times we believe if someone does not agree with everything that we are doing and how we want to get it done, that they are working against us. Number six, realize that the issues people face have multiple layers, and each layer needs to be addressed to provide holistic support to constituents, communities, and the individuals you serve. Now, some people may find intersectionality a bit overwhelming because they're like, okay, so when we begin to unpack all these layers, then I cannot serve this person in all this capacity. And intersectionality lens is not calling or asking you to serve these individuals in every capacity of the layers that converge and act as barriers. It allows you to unpack those layers, identify what those layers are, name those layers, and the areas that you specialize in, then you provide that service to the community or the groups of people or to the individual. The other areas that you do not specialize in, you now tap into your networks and your allies to provide the service to this particular community or this individual. And intersectionality also opened the doors for awesome collaboration and says to us, you are not alone in this work. So don't get overwhelmed, all right? Number 7, the decision is always yours, whether or not you would like to incorporate an intersectionality lens in your work, all right? And I hope that this video has provided you with some insight on how to increase your advocacy effectiveness and the importance of incorporating an intersectionality lens in your advocacy planning and also the work that you do. I leave you with this quote by Martin Luther King Jr. Cowardice asks the question, is it safe? Expediency asks the question, is it politic? Vanity asks the question, is it popular? But conscience asks the question, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but one must take it because one's conscience tells one that it is right. You have been listening to The Intersection. I'm your host, Shona Alexander Benjamin, the place where we center conversations on social and economic issues, including personal growth, living intentionally, women, peace, and security. Remember, live intentionally because you can, and always keep a goal in mind. Until next time, be safe and have a great day.